You know, these people.
Cool.
Bienvenidos y bienvenidas al programa Autores de Historias. Autores de Historias es el programa radiofónico del Departamento de Historia de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia en Bogotá, en el que se promueve a los autores de investigadores de la historia de Colombia y de América Latina en general. Los protagonistas de este programa radiofónico no son los acontecimientos, ni los personajes históricos, ni los procesos históricos. En primer plano estarán las personas, los autores de todas estas narraciones que han ido configurando la memoria histórica. Los realizadores de este programa son el profesor César Augusto Ayala Diago, junto con los estudiantes Gonzalo Andrés Ramírez Bernal y Cristian Leonardo Vargas Pinedo, todos del Departamento de Historia. Entonces, otra vez, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a todos y a todos los radioyentes de Colombia y fuera de Colombia. Nuestro invitado de hoy es el profesor Stephen G. Rabe. Stephen Rabe es profesor titular de Historia en la Universidad de Texas, en la ciudad de Dallas, en Estados Unidos. Y no estoy exagerando cuando les cuento que el profesor Stephen Rabe es uno de los expertos más reconocidos en su campo de investigación, que son las relaciones internacionales de Estados Unidos y más específicamente la política exterior estadounidense frente a América Latina, sobre todo en el periodo que llamamos la Guerra Fría. Otros temas de investigación de nuestro profesor invitado tienen que ver con la sociedad estadounidense y la historia de la esclavitud en Estados Unidos. El profesor ha publicado hasta la fecha 9 libros y una cantidad impresionante de artículos en revistas especializadas, capítulos de libros, todas publicaciones que resultaron ser muy influyentes entre los estudiosos de la política exterior estadounidense. Publicaciones además que resultaron en una serie de premios y reconocimientos a nivel nacional e internacional. Publicaciones que se encuentran hoy en día entre las lecturas obligatorias para estudiantes de pregrado y posgrado en muchas universidades dentro y fuera de Estados Unidos, incluyendo la Universidad Nacional de Colombia en Bogotá. Nos sorprende, por lo tanto, que el profesor Stephen Rabe se convirtió en uno de los profesores más buscados cuando se trata de invitar a un experto de la política exterior de Estados Unidos y sus impactos sobre América Latina. De hecho, hasta la fecha, el profesor ha dictado conferencias, clases y cursos enteros en más de 20 países. El profesor Stephen Rabe está con nosotros, es decir, con el Departamento de Historia en Bogotá, durante todo el mes de noviembre del año en curso, quiero decir 2016, dictando una serie de conferencias y clases relacionadas con sus temas de investigación, además de brindar asesorías individuales para estudiantes en tesis. De ahí adelante, sin embargo, me toca cambiar de idioma. Lo lamento mucho. El resto de la entrevista que sigue ahora con el profesor Stephen Rabe de la Universidad de Texas en Dallas se dará en inglés. Entonces cambiamos ahora el idioma. Professor Rabe, welcome to Bogotá and to the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. I would like to start this interview on a more personal note. You studied at the Liberal Arts College, that is Hamilton College in the state of New York, where you received a BA, a pregrado, in 1970, and then went on to study at the University of Connecticut, where you received your PhD in 1977. Professor Rabe, tell us a bit more about your undergraduate and graduate studies, and more specifically, how did you find to history?
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to respond to this interview. I apologize to the audience that I'm answering in English. I do work in the Spanish language, but I think it would be best if I express my thoughts in English. Now, as to the first question, my studies as an undergraduate and as a graduate at Hamilton College and the University of Connecticut were really only a culmination of a lifetime interest in history, in the sense that ever since I was probably in primary school, somewhere in the ages of 6, 7, 8, 9 years of age, that I was very, very interested in history. I think this is in part because I often lived with my take me to a variety of historical sites, initially in New York City, and then my parents and my grandparents, since they knew I had an interest in history, that they took me to sites such as Mount Vernon and Washington, and they took me to various Civil War battlefields, etc. And even as a very young, I think in 4th grade, so when I was about 10 years of age, I was contributing money to preserve various historical sites in the United States. When I was both in grammar school and high school, I took preference tests in terms of what might be my vocation, and I always came out as a history teacher. So that there was very little doubt in my mind that when I went to college that I would study history and major in history, and that continued into graduate school. I suppose the key thing would be, why did I choose a particular type of field? I was always interested in Latin America, and I was always interested in knowing something about Latin America, probably related to the fact that in high school, the language that I studied was Spanish, and continued to study that in college. So that kind of was a sort of entree into doing something about Latin American history. And so I began to, perhaps in college and then certainly in graduate school, focus on Latin American history, and then particularly since where I attended at the University of Connecticut, in Storrs, Connecticut, there was a very, very, very famous professor there by the name of Thomas Patterson, and I felt that if I studied with Dr. Patterson, whose specialty was U.S. foreign relations, that I would have a very good patron that would help me find a position and help me enter the academic world. And so it became a natural, therefore, to sort of study U.S. foreign relations, and then, of course, to particularly focus U.S. foreign relations on my interest in Latin America.
Okay. And how did you find your dissertation topic? The title was The United States and Venezuela, 1908 until 1948, and this was under the direction of the person you mentioned, that's Professor Thomas Patterson, who is one of the most prestigious experts on U.S. foreign relations. And later you published it as a book, The Road to OPEC, United States Relations with Venezuela. Just tell us a bit, how did you get to this topic? What was it that intrigued you about U.S. relations with Venezuela?
Right. Well, surely, I mean, there are always several reasons why I began the study of U.S. relations with Venezuela. The first, like any graduate student, you're always looking for a dissertation topic that no one has ever done. And of course, no one had written a comprehensive history of U.S. relations with Venezuela in the first half or the first 3/4 of the 20th century. So that would be one thing. Simply, it was just a matter of opportunity. Here was a subject no one had studied. The second particular reason, of course, is that it seemed to me very intriguing that no one had studied U.S. relations with Venezuela, because the United States had more money invested in Venezuela. U.S. private investors had, through most of the 20th century, invested more money in Venezuela than in any other country in Latin America. This, of course, because of Venezuela's great oil resources. So you had here, of course, the issues of Standard Oil of New Jersey, present-day Exxon, Gulf Oil, and Shell Oil, a British-Dutch oil company. So there are a variety of issues there. The third thing, of course, is that when I'm choosing and finishing up graduate school is 1973, and the first oil crisis of the Western world. There had been the Arab oil embargo, and there became a great deal of interest in the organization called the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which most people assumed was a Middle Eastern innovation, but in fact had been founded by a Venezuelan by the name of the oil minister by the name of Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso. So all these things sort of came together. There was one other factor here, and that was the case of sources. There were very limited sources in Venezuela in terms of archival sources. I did do research in Venezuela. There were lots of published Venezuelan sources. But in this case, the rise of oil, Venezuela became synonymous with oil, and the rise of oil investment also had to do with a rivalry between the United States and the United Kingdom, where the United Kingdom initially dominated oil production in Venezuela. So I was able to use the records of the Public Record Office as well as the records of in the U.S. National Archives. So a whole variety of things came together in terms of what led me to do this study.
So the Public Record Office, that is the British Public Record Office.
That is correct. That's
and
correct.
We refer to the National Archives. That's the National Archives in Washington.
That is correct.
To give you an idea about how this works in
Right.
terms of
So
sources.
it was also, people were beginning to be interested in so-called multi-archival research, of never trying to write your history from the perspective of simply one country. So here I was able to at least do research in Venezuela, though I found very little archival material. I was able to include a significant number of Venezuelan sources, as well as British sources and US sources.
Professor Rabe, you were born, if I may say that, in the late 1940s. And I guess that your generation was marked very much and hurt by the Vietnam War. Would you mind to tell us a bit more about that? How the Vietnam War
Sure.
loomed in your life?
I think it would be fair to say that the Vietnam War affected me both as a human being in a certain political sense, but also in an academic sense. As you noted, I was born in 1948. I'm part of the so-called post-war baby boom. And I came of age during the Vietnam War, where being drafted and being sent to Vietnam to fight in a war was a real possibility. The Vietnam War very much changed me politically. It gave me a view of the United States that I had previously not had. I was an opponent of the Vietnam War. I spent several years in anti-war activity in opposing the Vietnam War. And there's very little doubt that the Vietnam War gave me a kind of critical perspective thereafter on U.S. foreign policy. And I think that I've maintained that over the past 40 years. Also, from a personal point of view, I had several friends who died in Vietnam. And this tended to be a very kind of shaping formation on me. In my high school class, 5 of my classmates died in Vietnam. I had a friend from college who died in Vietnam. And in many cases, all of their lives were wasted. Since nothing was accomplished today, the United States and Vietnam are almost allies, and Vietnam remains a communist country. It was an unjust war, it was an unwise war, and of course led me intellectually then to raise questions about the U.S. role in the world. I should note in terms of the military that while I did not serve in Vietnam, I did serve in the military, and I spent 6 years in the United States Marine Corps on active and reserve duty. Joining the Marine Corps was one way of avoiding going to Vietnam.
That is a thing that is difficult to understand from here, from Colombia, because if we hear about a war where the United States is engaged, above all in Latin America, the first thing that springs to mind is the Marine Corps.
How was this? Yes,
Yeah.
very, very good question. What I joined was the so-called Marine Corps Reserve, in which I did a period of active duty, but then for several years was in reserve, where I only would attend military meetings once a month for 2 days, and then I would serve for 2 weeks on active duty. The Marine Corps Reserves, like the National Reserves and the U.S. National Guard and the Navy Reserves, etc., were areas where people joined, and Lyndon Johnson and thereafter Richard Nixon were unlikely. They could have called up the reserves and sent them to Vietnam, but were unlikely to do so because often they were filled with college graduates or with parents who had some form of political efficacy and some form of political power. So joining the reserves at that particular time was a way of avoiding going to Vietnam, but at the same time not defying the law by either going to Canada or refusing the draft, etc.
The training must have been incredibly hard. Entering the Marine Corps?
Well, the Marine Corps is physically extremely difficult. I certainly come from a family of military veterans. My father was a paratrooper during World War II. He was a member of the 82nd Airborne. He jumped into Normandy on the day before the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, and had significant combat experience. And I had all of my uncles served in World War II also. So physically, the Marine Corps was very, very taxing. Mentally, it was also taxing, but ultimately, I probably made me somewhat different than other academics in that the Marine Corps can give you an enormous amount of self-confidence if you survive their training. And so I've always found that I'm a little bit different than other academics in that sense, also in the sense that I've had experiences that other academics may not have had.
Mm-hmm. Going back to your publications, when I read that right, the first book you did publish was an anthology called Slavery in American Society, a book that was re-edited 3 times until the 1990s and published together with Richard Brown and in the subsequent 3rd edition with Lawrence Goodhart. Tell us about this book.
Sure. First off, the study of slavery is something that is essential to the study of the Western Hemisphere. Often the study of slavery is perceived as something different, something evil, that something happened in the United States, that might have happened in Colombia, that might have happened in Brazil. But in fact, slavery is absolutely essential to the evolution and development of the Western Hemisphere. I think prior to 1820, more Africans migrated to the New World as slaves than people from Europe. So it's an essential thing to study slavery. Okay. The second thing is that, of course, in doing this and being asked by the original author, Richard Brown, who was trying to help me, asking me to be the editor of the 2nd and then the 3rd editions, is that I was able to bring the perspective of studying both U.S. and Latin American history. In that slavery in American society, the American is a broad term, meaning both Latin America and the United States. And so we have a section there comparing slavery in Latin America to slavery in the United States. And so I think, of course, there are a variety of points of contact always between U.S. and Latin American history or Western Hemisphere history. One, of course, being slavery, another being that both areas are areas of immigration. That it's very easy to write comparative history about immigration to the United States in the 19th century and immigration to the southern cone of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay in late 19th, early 20th century.
Mm-hmm. And in your subsequent work, you focus squarely on Cold War issues, starting with Eisenhower and Latin America, The Foreign Policy of Anti-Communism, a book that was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 1988, and others that will be mentioned later. For now, I would like to know, what was it that drew your attention above all to the Cold War?
Well, I probably have to say it has an element of opportunism in this sense, that as my career progresses, we are having records declassified. By and large, the rule in the United States is that all records that are 30 years or older should be declassified. The reality, it usually takes about 40 years. So as I was looking at my 2nd book here, writing in the latter part of the 1980s, it's about this time that all of the records of the Eisenhower administration are being declassified. So it provides an enormous opportunity for a historian to write something that no one has touched on the subject. Well, certainly there were some studies about the U.S. role in Latin America during the Eisenhower years, particularly in the intervention in Guatemala. There was no comprehensive history. And I was able to write a comprehensive history by having access to archives and access to sources, which is always critical for a historian. And so pretty much through much of my career, I seem to almost be following the declassification process, having written a book about John Kennedy some years later, publishing that in 1999, and even today working on Henry Kissinger, even as the records of the Richard Nixon administration and the Gerald Ford administration have been declassified. So that may be part of it. And then, of course, as you begin to develop an expertise in a particular area, you feel very, very comfortable about this. You develop a thesis, you know where all the records are, where all the manuscript collections are, where all the private papers are, and so you can write with some sense of confidence and perhaps even some authority about a particular period.
Mm-hmm. About the Eisenhower administration, was there anything that really struck you as surprising when you were going through the archival records, or was it more or less what you expected?
No, I think probably that there was a much stronger anti-communist element and much stronger pursuit of Cold War in Latin America than I anticipated. I was very struck yesterday, of course, over this weekend, Fidel Castro had died. And one of the blaring headlines of the New York Times, and in the column written by Anthony De Palma, who was perceived in the New York Times as its expert on Cuba and Fidel Castro, one of the headlines said, "Fidel Castro brought the Cold War to the Western Hemisphere." Well, this is factually inaccurate, simply factually inaccurate. It ignores the U.S. destabilization of the Arbenz regime in Guatemala in 1954, a constitutional government, and also ignores the support for anti-communist military dictators, such as in Colombia in the 1950s, awarding medals to the Colombian dictator in the 1950s, awarding medal to the Venezuelan dictator, Marcos Pérez Jiménez in the 1950s, simply because they were anti-communist. It ignores the role of Central Intelligence activities in the 1950s. And it also, what was most intriguing to me, what I found in the Eisenhower administration, was that there were some records in which part of it was what is called redacted, in which part of a passage was simply blanked out. And ultimately, I was able to find what this passage meant by finding in other people's papers copies of the original document. And in the original, the United States in 1948 had joined the Organization of American States. And Article 16 of the Organization of American States says that no nation has the right to intervene in the internal affairs of another nation for any reason whatsoever. This is a treaty obligation. But what I found in the Eisenhower papers, which was initially redacted and remains redacted, but I found the original through finding copies in other people's papers, in which the Eisenhower administration in 1953 said that it could not abide by the OAS resolution, that it was going to ignore the OAS resolution, and it said that the United States would be prepared to take all actions deemed appropriate if a Latin American nation in any way sided with the Soviet Union or allied with the Soviet Union. So again, probably back to your question, what I found was how vigorous the Eisenhower administration was pursuing Cold War in Latin America. And again, the idea that Fidel Castro brought the Cold War to Latin America is simply historically inaccurate.
I saw that headline actually, and I immediately thought of you and whether you.
And I published. Yes, I did. I
yes.
published a letter to a little point to the New York Times, which was recommended by several people, and I even noticed a Colombian woman said, "Thank you, Professor Rabe, for that the comment was ahistorical, was ideological, and partisan." That is, to say, the comment that Fidel Castro had brought the Cold War to Latin America.
So I already won a bet. I betted on that you would do that. So I won.
Yes, I did.
So moving on to another book, which you published with Thomas Patterson, called Imperial Search, the United States Abroad, 1890s to the early 1900s. And in this perspective, or related a question to this book, a strong debate at the moment in the United States and elsewhere, whether or not to classify the United States as an imperialist state. And what is striking is that even rather conservative historians like the British Nigel Ferguson now got used to refer to the United States as an imperial power, and his word, an empire in denial. I guess in that publication you did analyze a period where the United States very openly intervened and very openly advanced imperialistic goals. What is your take on this debate about imperialism?
Right. Well, first off, of course, as you correctly point out, the period from 1895 to 1904 would always fit the kind of formal definition of imperialism. The United States created an empire in the Philippine Islands and annexed Guam, Samoa, Wake Island, annexed Hawaii, and of course, in the Venezuelan boundary crisis of 1895, announced that the Western Hemisphere was a sphere of influence of the United States, that its fiat was practically law in the Western Hemisphere, and that whatever the United States did was law in the Western Hemisphere. And then, of course, as Colombians know, the United States fomented a revolution in Panama and detached Panama from Colombia, and then, of course, proceeded to establish the Panama Canal and establish a protectorate over Panama, also establish a protectorate over Cuba, annex Guantanamo Bay, and forced the Cubans to sign a treaty saying the U.S. had the right to intervene in Cuba. So by any definition, this was traditional formal imperialism. Even very, very traditional historians like Samuel Flagg Bemis would admit this period from 1895 to 1904 is a period of imperialism. But one of the larger questions is, was this simply an aberration in U.S. history, or was this a continuation of a policy that had developed in the 19th century in terms of continental expansion, the conquest of indigenous people, the conquest of Mexico in the 1840s. Was this a continuation, and did it continue in the 20th century? So this particular book does play with this definition of empire, imperialism, etc. And I very much take a kind of functional approach to this definition of imperialism. That is to say that if one country stands in a relationship with another country, where that country cannot act on its own foreign policy interests without the approval of the more dominant country or the more powerful country, then I would suggest that this is an imperial relationship. Now, all countries are interdependent, and all countries exercise influence on other countries, but it's really kind of measuring the amount of power. If one country cannot take actions that it perceives to be in its national interest because it fears the reaction of the dominant power in the region, I would suggest that that is an imperial relationship. I think I actually use a quotation that says, you might need an hydraulic engineer to give you the exact flow of water, but anybody can see that water flows downhill. So how you measure this is always somewhat imprecise, this sort of imperial relationship. And there is clearly, all countries are interdependent. But nonetheless, it seems to me that what followed with interventions in the Caribbean, interventions in the first third of the 20th century, in Cuba, in the Dominican Republic, in Honduras, in Nicaragua, in the Canal Zone itself, would all suggest that the United States was on the path of an imperial path. And its relationship with Latin America, you could call it a sphere of influence if you want, but it was an imperial relationship that it essentially has been maintained for the period since 1895.
Mm-hmm. Moving on to another of your important publications, The Most Dangerous Area in the World, John F. Kennedy Confronts Communist Revolution in Latin America, 1999, the University of North Carolina Press. It focuses on the Kennedy years, obviously, and on the Alliance for Progress, La Alianza para el Progreso. What is your view of the Alliance for Progress, or more generally on the Kennedy in subsequent years? In the relations with...
Well, let me tell a little bit for how I came to do the study. One, again, there is the opportunity that records are being declassified in the Kennedy administration. I would also say there was probably a personal interest in John F. Kennedy because John F. Kennedy I grew up as a Catholic. I attended religious schools, or what we call parochial schools in the United States. I, like most Catholics, was extremely excited when John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, becoming the first Catholic elected to the presidency in the United States, and I guess remaining the only Catholic to be elected to the presidency of the United States. So there was that, and then of course his tragic assassination on November 22nd, 1963. That of course had an impact on me as a young person. And then let us also note that I teach at the University of Texas at Dallas, and of course it was in the city of Dallas that John Kennedy was assassinated. Now, in terms of the Alliance for Progress, I found this a very kind of interesting sort of situation. John F. Kennedy is the first, along with Franklin Roosevelt, but really the first president, I think, who actually liked Latin Americans. He liked being in the presence of Latin Americans. He thought he became very good friends with Romulo Betancourt, the president of Venezuela, with Jose Figueres, the president of Costa Rica, and of course with President Lleras Camargo here in Colombia. He liked Latin American culture, he liked Latin American thought, culture, society, and history, and he actually wanted to have a Marshall Plan for Latin America. He wanted Latin America to develop socially and economically. But we cannot be naive. The Alliance for Progress was an anti-communist program. It was in response to the Cuban Revolution and the specter of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution spreading throughout Latin America. And so there is a very much of a hardline anti-communist edge to the Kennedy administration's approach to the Alliance for Progress. The reality is that President Kennedy continually authorized covert interventions in Latin America from 1961 through 1963, and that he looked askance at any country that did not break relations with Fidel Castro's Cuba. And so what I say near the end of the book is that while he had some very, very progressive goals for Latin America, he generally wanted to help Latin Americans, he wanted socioeconomic development, he wanted to build more schools, he wanted to improve sewage treatment, he wanted to make sure Latin Americans had clean water, that he wanted to improve, build hospitals, to promote science and technology in Latin America, that he was undermining his own policies by covertly intervening in Latin America and often opposing Latin American Democrats who were liberal but would not take his same point of view on Fidel Castro.
So this is a dark undercurrent in the Alliance for Progress that would point in a direct continuity with the Eisenhower administration. You see, there is a very strong continuity.
Right, and I would generally argue from 1945 to 1989, the Cold War anti-communism undermines many of the U.S. efforts in Latin America, but it is a persistent strain. And if people want to say, well, Ronald Reagan fought these mercenary wars in Central America in the 1980s, I would probably have to argue that his policies are not particularly different than the policies of John Kennedy or the policies of Dwight Eisenhower, that there is a persistent strain that the Latin America is a sphere of influence of the United States, and that any specter of communism, any tie with the Soviet Union is a threat to the national security of the United States, would undermine the U.S. ability to act in other parts of the world, for example, in terms of defending West Berlin, and would become a political problem. That is to say, you would be charged with losing a Latin American country to communism, and you would pay a political price at the ballot box.
Professor Rabe, in 2005, and continuing with this theme, Cold War, you published a book with the University of North Carolina Press called U.S. Intervention in British Guyana, a Cold War story. British Guyana has received very little attention up to date. There's very few investigations in general about British Guyana and less about U.S. intervention there. At the same time, you once mentioned to me that this is a book you yourself consider the best of your publications so far. Would
Correct.
you care to explain that?
Right. Well, again, there's a whole variety of things that happen here. When I was at the Kennedy administration, when I was at the Kennedy Library doing my book, The Most Dangerous Area in the World, and I was doing research, I was stunned, and this was confirmed by the archivist, that there was more material on British Guiana in the Kennedy Library in Boston, Massachusetts, that it was the only relations with the Soviet Union and Cuba and issues like the defense of West Berlin, where there are more records at the Kennedy Library than on British Guiana, which was a very small British colony, present-day Guyana, in northern South America, the only English-speaking country in South America. And I was intrigued that there were so many records. And so, as it turned out, there is a chapter in The Most Dangerous Area in the World on British Guiana. But thereafter, I began to pursue a longer study. Again, here we have records available at the Public Record Office. This being a British colony, virtually all of the Guyanese records Guyanese internal records were at the Public Record Office. And then, of course, I had the records of the Kennedy Library as well as at the National Archives, and then again, sorts of newspapers, etc. It's an incredibly intriguing story because Guyana is a country today in which the majority of the population hails from Mother India. It's a country that's divided by race, ethnicity, and religion, either being the descendants of slaves or people who migrated to British Guyana as indentured servants in the 19th century. It's a country that has a very, very sad and troubled history. But what I was interested in here was looking at why the United States opposed a man, Chetty Jagan, from assuming power in a constitutional manner, a man who represented people of Indian background in British Guiana. And so it was an extremely intriguing story. It wasn't just a sort of Cold War intervention. Clearly the United States intervened. But it involved issues of race in terms of people from Indian background and African background. It involved issues of religion, Protestantism versus people who are Hindu or Muslim. It obviously involved issues of ethnicity, and then it also involved issues of gender, in that Chetty Jagan was married to a woman from Chicago by the name of Janet Jagan, Janet Rosenberg Jagan, who ironically is the first Anglo person ever to be elected president in the Western Hemisphere, because she subsequently would become president of Guyana in the 1990s. And so you had all these kinds of gender issues, race issues, ethnic issues, religious issues. In addition, it brought into the question of non-governmental actors, or NGOs, or non-state actors, in the sense that the American labor union stoutly opposed Chetty Jagan and used a variety of methods to destabilize the government of Chetty Jagan. And the United States brought enormous pressure upon the British not to grant independence and to prevent Chetty Jagan and his party, the People's Progressive Party, from assuming control of an independent Guyana. Now, why I consider this my most important study, probably because I have had literally 100 Guyanese write me individual letters telling me, thank you for telling our story of what happened to our country. I've done BBC interviews. The British now are aghast and embarrassed that they let the United States intervene in their own colony. And people who are in the labor unions, the AFL-CIO, are all embarrassed. Everyone agrees the United States miscalculated the situation. Chetty Jagan was not a stooge of the Soviet Union. He wasn't working for the Soviet Union. He was not a communist. He was a parliamentarian. He believed in constitutionalism. Everyone agrees. But the end result of the U.S. intervention in British Guiana / Guyana in the 1960s was to set black people against people of Indian heritage, and actually to foster a race war. And literally, it's taken this small country, which only has 700,000 people, it's literally taken them 30 to 40 years to get over what happened in this particular era. I might note that my book was used in a presidential campaign in the 21st century, where people were debating what I had said in my book about who was responsible for what had happened in the past, etc. The key thing, again, is that the U.S. intervention in British Guiana had really turned Afro-Guyanese against Indo-Guyanese. And it's been a very, very tragic situation in Guyana.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One thing which is very interesting for our history students in particular is to understand how does one reconstruct such a history. We have the National Archives in Washington, or College Park, close to Washington. We have the presidential libraries. Every US president, starting with Franklin D. Roosevelt, leaves the presidential
Actually,
library.
Herbert Hoover.
Starting with Hoover, leaves the presidential library with a lot of documents, personal papers, and so on. But if you work about, for example, in this case, trade unions being infiltrated by US agents or union delegates from the United States, where would one find the kinds of documents, kinds of materials, kinds of traces needed to reconstruct that?
Well, in this particular case, the AFL-CIO has its own archives, which is very close to the National Archives. And it was an amazing development to find that they had developed their own foreign policy. They had broken down the AFL-CIO in the same way the State Department had broken itself down into a variety of divisions, and that there was very, very close collaboration. And then the Kennedy administration would use the AFL-CIO as a way of infiltrating CIA agents into British Guiana as a way of destabilizing the country.
Mm-hmm. Great. Turning to your last book, The Killing Zone, a book with a very strong title, The Killing Zone, the United States Wages Cold War in Latin America, that was first published in 2011 and recently re-edited by Oxford University Press in 2016. This book was published, it seems, with a very explicit intent to remember your readers, and more specifically your readers in the United States, about the human costs of the Cold War in Latin America. Would you explain a bit?
I'd come to a conclusion. Certainly, as I said, I'm very proud of my book, The U.S. Intervention in British Guiana, and it's had a very, very significant reaction in present-day Guyana, but of course only has 700,000 people. It's relatively well known by scholars in the United States, and then of course it's had an impact in areas such as England because of the the sense that the United States had done something in the British Empire, and there's a very large Guyanese population in London, as there's a very large Guyanese population in Toronto, and as well as New York City. So certainly that, I felt that I had reached something beyond the academic audience with the U.S. intervention in British Guiana. But at this particular point in my career, I had said I'd written books such as The Most Dangerous Area in the World, The Road to OPEC, Eisenhower in Latin America, and these were mainly just reaching scholarly audiences. And I felt that at some point, and of course always addressing certain scholarly issues, and that may have only interest to scholars. And I said to myself, at some point in my life, I really want to say what I believe and what I think. And this was also informed by the fact that by this time I had taught in Argentina several times, I taught in Brazil, I taught in Ecuador, and ultimately, of course, I'd be teaching here in Colombia. And so I said to myself that I really wanted to do a book in which I would address some of the costs of the Cold War, in the sense that post-1989, there had been very little reflection within the United States about what the Cold War had cost, and that it had been a global Cold War. Certainly people celebrated the fact that Eastern Europe was free, and certainly people celebrated the fact that the Baltic republics were free of Soviet domination. And this is all a very, very good thing. But most of the Cold War wasn't fought in Europe. It was fought in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. And the people of Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and especially Latin America had paid a very, very high price. So I was particularly addressing that particular issue. I was also addressing the issue, I think, that Latin America had become marginalized in the study of international relations in the United States as being insignificant and unimportant. And I wanted to raise that particular issue. Now, as you said, the title has a strong title, The Killing Zone. And I wanted to emphasize that literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Latin Americans had either died during the Cold War or had gone into exile. That these particular interventions in Guatemala, beginning in Guatemala in 1954, interventions in British Guiana, interventions in Brazil, the invasion of the Dominican Republic, interventions in Chile, interventions in the 1980s in Central Americas, had brought about a terrible, terrible cost. And I felt that I wanted to inform people who studied U.S. foreign relations about the costs of this. In addition, I wanted to write a book that wasn't free of academic cant and academic jargon, didn't address academic issues, spoke directly to students, advanced undergraduates, graduate students, to the educated public, and to make my point as clearly and as precisely as possible, and to say what I really believed. Now, my intention, my audience, I hoped, would be people who taught courses in U.S. foreign relations who would assign this book. And that does happen. As it turns out, the book sells very well, and it's widely known and widely used, but it's basically used in courses that teach Latin American history. And I've been invited by many professors who teach Latin American history to lecture at their universities because Latin Americans understood this. So I've never really quite reached my target audience of people who teach U.S. foreign relations to say, well, this was the impact of U.S. foreign relations. But nonetheless, I'm pleased with the general reception. And of course, in a peculiar way, I've probably become more identified with this book than any other particular book, because it is widely used in classrooms. It's widely used in Latin America. It's known throughout Latin America.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? What makes it so difficult to reach a wider public in the United States about topics that touch upon difficult periods in their own history and failures of their own foreign policies, or strong effects of their own foreign policy?
Well, I think probably here, in the case of the Cold War, the United States obviously has a European outlook, and the fact is that the people of Poland, the people of Hungary, the people of Czechoslovakia or Czech or Slovakia, the people of Bulgaria, the people of Romania, certainly the people of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are extremely grateful what they perceive as the United States' approach to the Soviet Union, the containment policy, the refusal to accept in principle forever the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and the Baltic republics. And so that sort of overwhelms any sense of the enormous cost. Certainly there's some regret about Vietnam. Certainly there's some regret about the Korean War. But there's very little kind of questioning of what happened in other parts of the world, in which virtually all the participants will say, well, these interventions in Guatemala or the British Guiana or Brazil, we miscalculated, we made mistakes. What happened in Central America, we made mistakes here. There's an element, I suppose, that I think that there's still a kind of point of view of which I address in the Killing Zone, of perceiving Latin Americans as children of a lesser God. And so I think that plays a role. And then, of course, there's some scholars who are going to say, well, it was the Argentines who murdered 30,000 people. We, the United States, did not murder 30,000 people. It was the death squads in El Salvador that murdered 75,000 people. But that's, you know, it's, while I'm never arguing in the Killing Zone that the United States is directly responsible for the murder of 30,000 Argentines, or the murder of 75,000 Salvadorans, or the murder of 200,000 Guatemalans, and we are speaking about murder here, that there is in legal terms something called aiding and abetting. And I would simply argue that the United States aided and abetted a variety of murderous regimes in the name of anti-communism during the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. A very closely related topic, Henry Kissinger and all of this. You are now writing a book about Henry Kissinger, and looking at it, one could think that all what is to know about Henry Kissinger and foreign policies is already known and being published. Do you find anything surprising there?
Well, by and large, most of the Henry Kissinger scholarship focuses on détente, focuses on relations with the Soviet Union, focuses on Richard Nixon's opening to China, and is somehow related to kind of what's perceived as high policy, you know, or high foreign policy. There's relatively, you know, there are obviously some things on Kissinger in Vietnam. So here again, it's an opportunity. No one has done anything on Kissinger in Latin America. Quite obviously, Kissinger is most identified with his support for the overthrow of Salvador Allende. And virtually in his memoirs, it's essentially the only topic he addresses in terms of relations with Latin America. Henry Kissinger evokes very, very strong emotions among people who study Latin American history. As I've remarked, that people who study Latin American history have said that they could not write a book about Henry Kissinger, that they would become too angry, that they would think about Salvador Allende, and they would think about the horrors that occurred in Chile. Now, again, the records are now open, and we have all the State Department records of the Nixon and Ford administration. What provides a particular opportunity here for Henry Kissinger is that he had 15,000 telephone conversations, and he transcribed all of them. In addition, in terms of his records, he insisted that his aides write down in the vernacular what he had said. So you get a very, very intriguing and very open look at Henry Kissinger's mind. My point that I'm going to make in this study on Henry Kissinger and Latin America is that it's more than Chile. Chile is very important. Certainly the overthrow of Salvador Allende is very important, and certainly the Kissinger support for the Pinochet regime is also extremely important. But there are a whole variety of other issues we'd like to look at. Relations with Mexico, relations with the left-wing military rulers in Peru, relations with Argentina. What role did Kissinger play in providing the green light to the La Guerra Sucia or El Proceso in Argentina that led to the death of 30,000 people? What is his relationship with the Guatemalan military dictators of the late 60s and 1970s, and also what is Kissinger's role, for example, in leading to the Panama Canal treaties. So there's a wide variety of subjects to study and to give a kind of balanced, but I think ultimately it's going to be a fairly highly critical view of Henry Kissinger and his support for non-democratic governments in Latin America, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Chile, in Argentina, in Bolivia, in Paraguay.
You once mentioned that you were a bit surprised about the nature of the kind of documentation you can now access, the openness with which Kissinger and his aides and consult. Yeah.
Yes, and the other thing, I mean, there's an enormous amount of documentary material, more documentary material than I've ever seen on any particular Secretary of State or leading international diplomat or any particular presidential administration. What's also quite interesting to me is that was the assumption that Kissinger had no real interest in Latin America. And the fact is, particularly when he became Secretary of State, he showed an enormous interest in Latin America. He would often spend hours meeting with various Latin Americans. Certainly, for example, in the case of Colombia, he was very good friends with President López Michelsen, and spent a large amount of time in discussion with him and a large amount of time in discussion with Colombian foreign ministers. So what I find is that he was very, very interested in Latin America, and that he was more than willing to help in a kind of John Kennedy-like or Franklin Roosevelt manner in terms of social and economic progress in Latin America if it did not involve an East-West issue, if it did not involve the issue of communism. On the other hand, if it did, then he was a hardline anti-communist, a hardline Cold Warrior, and I think ultimately I'm going to suggest that he believed that Latin Americans would be better off under kind of military government as for example, the military rulers in Brazil.
Do you already know when it will be published?
I have a particular writing plan. What I hope is to submit the manuscript to Cornell University Press in 2018, and I've already signed an advance contract, and that I would hope that it would see the light of day sometime in 2019.
Mm-hmm. Moving on to a more general topic, Professor Rabe, for more than 30 years you have closely followed the scholarship in your field of studies, the history of US foreign relations, especially the United States policies towards Latin America. First of all, I would like to ask you to explain a bit in very general terms the intellectual currents that are present in this field of study, and where you yourself would locate yourself, where you feel most at home intellectually, in which of those?
If we go first specific and then to the more general. Mm-hmm. Okay. Generally speaking, I would think that most scholarship on the history of U.S. relations with Latin America tends to be critical, tends to find that the United States, in its relations with Latin America, has not upheld the principles that it espouses, the principles of Woodrow Wilson of the 14 points, the principles of Franklin Roosevelt of the 4 freedoms, the ideas that John Kennedy expressed in his inaugural address, that the United States has frequently violated those principles over the past 120 years in relations with Latin America, particularly in terms of interventionism, in terms of support for American businesses, its failure to uphold constitutionalism, and to support military dictators. So most of the scholarship on U.S.-Latin American relations tends to be critical. The biggest issue that I think that appears in U.S.-Latin American relations historiography at the present time is this issue of agency. I think that some very bad history is written in which Latin Americans are perceived solely as the objects of U.S. foreign policy, in which whatever the United States does in Latin America, given the asymmetry of power, is the controlling influence on Latin American lives. That's very, very bad history. Latin Americans are their own actors. It's a question again here of kind of balancing out the relationship between the power of the United States and the individual abilities of Latin Americans to make their own decisions, as well as to influence the power of the United States. Again, as they say, all countries are interdependent. Now, on the bigger question here of writing history that I think is fair and balanced, but is also critical, that is to say, I think that an historian, if you're going to be involved in international relations, you have to try to do as much multi-archival work as possible. You need to visit as many countries as possible. It's also very good to teach in other countries to get other types of perspectives. And so when you write international relations, I think you really can't have a country. You can't be defending the country you live in. You have to be a citizen of the world. Okay. Now, in the scholarship in terms of criticism, obviously, as I said, I was studying during the Vietnam War, where a very critical point of view began to emerge, often associated with the so-called Wisconsin School of Diplomatic History, with names such as William Appleman Williams, Walter Lefebvre, Lloyd Gardner, who took a critical point of view about the United States. And I've always pretty much been guided, I think, by the kind of principles that William Appleman Williams espoused in The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, which was first published, I think, in 1959, in which he used the term tragedy. And in tragedy, we often note that in like a Shakespearean tragedy, the protagonist has a fatal flaw. And William Appleman Williams listed a kind of sort of what he perceived as 3 principles to the U.S. approach to the world. One, that the United States believed in democracy, believed in constitutionalism, believed in the rule of law. 2, He believed that the United States, that U.S. foreign policy and U.S. citizens were motivated by a warm, humanitarian, generous spirit. But 3, he argued that Americans perceived that the American way was the only way. And therefore, point number 3 was in contradiction to points numbers 1 and 2, and hence the tragedy of American diplomacy. Williams himself is often perceived as emphasizing economics and the economic drive of U.S. foreign policy, but I actually think it's much broader than that, and I would actually focus more on the kind of cultural aspect here, where the kind of point of view is that among Americans, it's very difficult for them to accept that there can be a variety of ways to the good life, as opposed to simply the American way.
Mm-hmm. And looking at this academic field of yours, you will probably agree that it is expanding very vigorously. It has been expanding very vigorously for at least 10 or more years. Right. Looking at this, are you satisfied with what you are seeing? Or are there lacuna issues, themes that would require more attention? Or are you satisfied with the way people do this history? What is your take on that?
Well, I would generally say that my particular, the Society for the Historians of American Foreign Relations, of which I'm a member, has been very active in promoting a variety of ways to understand international relations, to take in all kinds of questions such as race, gender, ethnicity, to take in the role of non-state actors, to take in the role of NGOs, to consider a whole variety of cultural issues, to expand, to use social history, cultural history, to apply a variety of those methods. And basically I'm a sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom, that every particular approach is a good approach, every approach should be read, people shouldn't criticize people for taking one approach as opposed to another. And certainly I agree with many historians who argue for the issue of agency, and to recognize that people like Jorge Videla of Argentina, who oversees the murder of tens of thousands, or General Efrain Rios Montt of Guatemala, who oversees in 1 year the murder of 40,000 Mayan people, that they had their own reasons and their own explanations and their own philosophies for doing such things. On the other hand, I believe that some of my younger colleagues are still are failing to understand some of the basic laws of international politics. I see nothing to undermine Thucydides' approach that strong nations do what they want and smaller, weaker nations accept what they must. And so sometimes I think in the study of U.S. foreign relations, in an attempt to be new and different, people are forgetting the issue of power. The relationship between the United States and Latin America has been, for most of the period since 1895, an asymmetrical relationship. The United States has a good deal more power than any individual Latin American country or the region as a whole. And if you forget that basic issue, I think that you are not writing history that is particularly accurate or factual or meaningful. And I find that among some of my younger colleagues, in their desire to develop new ways of understanding international relations, they're failing to understand that basic issue of power. Certainly, some of the younger historians criticize me for overemphasizing the issue of power, and perhaps that may be an accurate one. But I fail to accept the point of view of those who don't deal with the issue of power. Now, as we move into the late 20th century and the post-Cold War era, is the asymmetrical relationship between the U.S. and Latin America changing? Yes, I think it clearly is. That I think that Latin Americans, as they develop socially, economically, as they develop other forms of relationships with other nations, that they're more successful balancing off the power of the United States.
And continuing with this topic, which is power, asymmetrical relations and everything, in very concrete terms, the Obama administration and the policies of the Obama administrations towards Latin America. What would you see there?
Well, I would say that probably during the first administration of the Obama administration, there was by and large a very kind of not a particularly comprehensive approach towards Latin America. When President Obama took office, there were in power, and some still remain in power, people such as Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, who basically wanted to talk about the past, wanted to talk about past U.S. injustices, and President Obama basically took the point of view, well, if you're not interested in me and if you're rehashing the past, then I'm not particularly interested in you. Okay. Now, to be sure, Obama during his first administration was preoccupied with trying to restore the U.S. economy as well as dealing with the fact that the U.S. was bogged down in wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan. In his second administration, I think that President Obama has become more interested in Latin America. His basic U.S. foreign approach in U.S. foreign policy is the U.S. should withdraw from the Middle East, which is simply to sink into a quagmire there, and should focus more on Asia and Latin America, which he perceives as having dynamic economies. He's obviously very interested in trade and believes in the expansion of trade. And of course, the United States and Colombia signed a trade agreement in 2011. And of course, he removed that last Cold War legacy by normalizing relations with Cuba under Raul Castro. Not completely normalized since there's still a trade embargo. And he's become far more active. I think he's become active in supporting President Santos in the peace process. He's become more active. He made a special trip to Argentina when he found that the Argentines wanted to look outward. And so I think that his general approach to Latin America had been to kind of draw closer, but particularly to draw closer on issues of trade. So what we have, what we have, of course, now is a free trade agreement with Chile, free trade agreement with Peru, free trade agreement with Panama, free trade agreement with Colombia, free trade agreement with Dominican Republic, and with Central America, and of course, overall, something inherited, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So I think his general view would be that there would be closer cooperation between the U.S. and Latin America, but particularly involved in kind of international commerce, and then exchanges of people, international exchanges, et cetera. I know that he's very, very much in favor of the Fulbright program in Latin America in the international exchange of scholars. So it's really, I think, a kind of his second term, and I think that what clearly helped in terms of improving relations with Latin America was normalization of relations with Cuba.
Mm-hmm. Mm. A last issue that's difficult to avoid in these days on presidential elections, November 8, sent shockwaves through the world at large, and particularly in Latin America. And at the moment it seems to be very difficult to foresee what exactly Donald Trump will do. But do you have any inkling about what his policies will be towards Latin America after announcing all sorts of really weird things like building a wall with Mexico?
All right. We can only speculate. I mean, he's approached Latin America, he said virtually nothing about Latin America during the presidential campaign, and if one was to look at his websites, I think you'd find very little on Latin America. So we'd have to speculate on kind of general terms. Those general terms would be the issues of immigration, the issues of trade, and perhaps the most specific issue, the issue of Cuba. So if we go backwards here, I really have no idea what his approach will be towards Cuba. I rather suspect that he's not going to try to rupture relations. We have diplomatic relations to Cuba. I rather suspect, however, that he will take very little efforts to normalize trade relations with Cuba. But that would be speculation. On the question of trade, obviously we have these variety of free trade agreements, the most prominent being NAFTA, free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, and then of course, as I said, with Panama, with Central America, with the Dominican Republic, and then with Colombia, Peru, and Chile. President Obama was in Lima last week suggesting that there could be some tampering with these free trade agreements. This would obviously be very negative for a whole variety of Latin American countries. In the case of Colombia, since the free trade agreement, Colombia has accelerated its economic cooperation with the United States, and at the present time, Colombia, about 30% of Colombia's exports are with the United States. Is he prepared to tamper with this? Is he prepared to tamper with NAFTA? I do not, I can only speculate. I think that there would be significant repercussions. Tampering with NAFTA, which involves about 50% of Mexico's economy, since Mexico's economy and 80% of Mexico's exports are to the United States, would create economic chaos in Mexico. That would create high unemployment and would force more people to try to migrate to the United States. all of this would be very, very counterproductive. So I don't really know. Now, finally, the issue of deportation. This is an issue that is very important in Latin America because there are now 52 million people of Latino background living in the United States, and about 11 million people, there are about 11 million people in the United States who are unauthorized, do not have proper papers. Probably, we can probably say 60, about half of such people are Mexicans, and then probably there's overall 60 to 70% of the 11 million are Latino. Right? What does that mean? What does that mean? Will there be deportations? How would that affect Central America? How might it affect Latin America? How will it affect the issue of sending remisas back to Latin America? At the present time, there's over $65 billion a year is remitted back to Latin America by Latinos living in the United States. In the case of Colombia, it's $4 billion a year remitted by Colombian Americans. So I don't really know. He said he wanted to deport 2 or 3 million people, which he alleged were criminals. On the other hand, there's stories in the New York Times today where mayors of various large cities, the mayor of New York, the mayor of Los Angeles, the mayor of Chicago, the mayor of medium-sized cities, mayors of medium-sized cities like Oakland, California, and the mayor of San Francisco are simply saying, we will not cooperate. We will not cooperate in the deportation of people. The local officials will not cooperate, and we will make our cities sanctuaries. So I think there's going to be very, very strong resistance. But I think it would be, to suggest that Donald Trump has a Latin American policy is, I really believe he does not have and has never really thought about it. Well, people have asked me, well, will Donald Trump's position be on the peace process? I rather suspect he does not know there is a peace process in Colombia.
Okay, that's many thanks indeed. Muchas gracias a ustedes y hasta pronto. Chao.